It was a hot topic in the office of the fact that when they hand you the envelope of cash, you immediately whip out your phone and take a photo of it. Tell us, first of all, why that was necessary, and second of all, how they reacted to that.
That was a completely spur-of-the-moment decision, so we never discussed that. I sat there and I was a bit concerned about the footage around me. So just by the issues or the material that is now publicly available, everybody can see that some of it is in a tree behind me, some of it was on a table next to us. I was a bit worried that, yes, we would have on camera a item handed to me, but it wouldn't be conclusively proven that it contains cash, South African currency. And literally at that moment, I took the chance. I knew the meeting was almost over. I knew I was at the point where I would make my exit speech, return the money to them and leave. And I thought that, what could really go wrong now?
Welcome to Daily Maverick's Power Chat. I'm Rebecca Davis, and we are here today to talk about easily one of the most jaw-dropping stories of the year. The suspended CEO of a government agency caught on camera trying to bribe a Daily Maverick journalist with cash. The journalist in question, Pieter-Louis Myburgh, who joins us here today. Pieter-Louis, thanks so much for making time for us.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm excited to unpack this issue. It certainly was a wild ride getting here.
Yeah, as your story today left us in no doubt. But let's just take a step back. This story hinges on the Independent Development Trust, the IDT. Can you remind us what that is and what it does?
Yeah, so the IDT is a state entity, a state-owned entity that slots under the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. So what the IDT does, it acts as an implementing agent for client departments. So the Department of Health, for instance, they can decide that some of their contracting or some of their procurement they want to outsource and not do in-house. And then they appoint the IDT to roll out certain infrastructure projects, as they did with the oxygen plant scandal that we exposed last year. In exchange for this, the IDT then takes a small management fee and then goes on and effectively appoints the contractors for the client department's initiatives. And it's got a largely public benefit infrastructure kind of mandate, social infrastructure mandate, focusing on clinics, schools, fixing roads that are in need of refurbishment, and then also these oxygen plants, again, that we looked at last year. It gets substantial amounts of funding flows through its accounts. Each year it spends in excess of 4 billion rand on these type of social infrastructure projects. So it's a big spender in terms of procurement, and this is why it's become such a contested terrain and such a important terrain in terms of ensuring that the procurement of board and clean, etc.
Pieter-Louis, I mean, everything you've just described sounds like it should be the mandate of the Department of Public Works. Why is it necessary to have this additional agency?
It is very strange. I mean, there are people wondering the same thing. If we're not essentially mimicking a department that already has the mandate to do this. But the body was effectively established with this whole social benefit, social infrastructure mandate. And it seems that there are certain instances where a client department just decides that it would be more effective for the IDT to handle its procurement or the rolling out of certain projects on its behalf instead of the department doing it themselves. But there is debate around whether it is effective and whether it's prudent to do it in that manner, and whether we aren't essentially seeing a situation where some of this work is unnecessarily being outsourced to another entity who then has to go and build their own department. So its functioning is it's up for debate, certainly.
Well, as we know, there is this bewildering plethora of kind of small state agencies seemingly getting away with murder, unfortunately, and thank goodness for investigative journalists. So on that note, what is it about them that piqued your interest, and how long have you been working on them? When did they first sort of swim onto your radar?
Yeah, so they definitely arrived on my radar by means of a tip-off regarding that oxygen plants contract. So that would have been in around, say, August last year, I think. August, September, and then we ended up publishing our first piece on that in October 2024. So roughly since around October 2024, I've been looking into several IDT issues, including the oxygen plants one. But then as the situation normally develops, you get contacted by individuals with information on the issue. The oxygen plants issue did cause something of a stir, and I was contacted by individuals who were privy to certain information, who invited me to, encourage me to look at some other contracts involving the IDT and some of the dealings involving the CEO, Mr. Tebogo Malaka, which then also led me to look at her property portfolio and some other financial dealings.
So, Pieter-Louis, just for the benefit of people who may not have been following the story, can you just sketch for us the oxygen plant scandal that started this all?
Yeah, so effectively, the IDT took up its implementing agent role for the National Department of Health last year, where the NDOH appointed the IDT to install oxygen plants at 55 government hospitals across South Africa. So there was this from 2019, around the COVID time, this need identified for more oxygen to be installed in public health facilities and clinics, hospitals and clinics. And to address this, the Department of Health, using global funds money, appointed the IDT to go and appoint these contractors. But then, obviously, very worryingly, the IDT ended up appointing these entities, these businesses. They didn't have the necessary accreditation to work with medical equipment, and all sorts of other shortcomings in the tender process. And of course, also the very worrying development with the quantum. There was a very detailed study done, a cost study in terms of what the quantum should entail. And then the amount just jumped from 200 billion rand to more than 800 million rand. So there's also a cost ballooning element to that contract.
And you were able to link this fairly conclusively to the CEO, Tebogo Malaka. Can you tell us a bit about Malaka, her background, where she comes from professionally?
Yeah, so Tebogo Malaka was actually at the IDT in the Northwest office and also held some other positions, senior positions within the entity. But she only in around 2022, was appointed as the acting CEO and then later the permanent CEO of the Independent Development Trust. So she's been at the institution for many years, and then quite recently, so in the recent years, rose to the position of CEO. And it must be said, has been involved in contentious developments at the IDT almost since the get-go. It became this kind of this terrain of contestation between several factors, some of them aligned to the previous minister who became the deputy minister under Dean McPherson. So there's certainly a lot of political contestation also around that entity. And then Ms. Malaka kind of slots into all of that.
There was this kind of confusing sideshow a few months ago where it alleged that the then newish Public Works Minister, Dean McPherson, as you said, had bribed you to write stories unflattering of Malaka. I mean, what is your take on the political machinations going on behind the scenes there?
There's evidently a very strong counter-narrative being driven on places like social media, especially during that time, to make it look like our critical reporting, but also Amamugani's and other media houses, those formed part of a smear campaign against Malaka. And this was supposedly done at the behest of Minister McPherson. And then even some of these detractors went as far as claiming that McPherson had paid me to run the smear campaign against Ms. Malaka. There were those fabricated WhatsApp messages that, unfortunately for the fabricators, contained pretty prominent mistakes, like my cell phone number not having one or two digits and not being correct, etc. But nevertheless, there certainly was an ongoing and very concerted effort to ensure that all the journalists who were looking at this entity critically were themselves, there were questions around their conduct, supposedly based on these WhatsApp or supposed WhatsApps, etc. And I suppose that broadly it's happened before. Look, so myself, other investigative journalists, other journalists in general, I think we've become quite accustomed to when you start hitting a nerve and exposing corruption and other malfeasance, there is quite frequently a counterattack. And it's become sort of par for the course a little bit. We do expect it frequently. And luckily, I think in the long run, those narratives don't really hold out very well. They do fall to the wayside when compared to the very detailed forensic evidence they're able to present in these reports.
Is there any evidence to suggest that Malaka is sort of politically protected, given the kind of scale of the fight back that seemed to be taking place there?
Yeah, so it ties to what we spoke about just now, is that this area of contestation, from what I understand, she is very closely aligned to Deputy Minister Sishe Zikalala, who, of course, surely quite begrudgingly had to make way for Minister Dean McPherson when the GNU was put together. And it's my understanding, and also the understanding of other journalists who've been following the IDT saga, that she is more closely aligned to former Minister Zikalala, and definitely not in the same as Minister McPherson.
Got you. That helps sketch the terrain. So you continued to look into Malaka, even as last week we saw the IDT board announce her suspension, but you were not done with the hapless CEO here.
And it's not a case of kicking a person when they're already lying down. It's just that we have in our crosshairs, I have in my crosshairs, what I believe is a very important public interest story involving another IDT contract, and then also concurrently a property being developed for Ms. Malaka, or by Ms. Malaka, in a upmarket estate in Gauteng. And that is really the issue that, considering the context here, seems to have prompted Ms. Malaka to go to these extraordinary lengths, this act of desperation, to try and pay me so that I would longer pursue that investigation.
If you appreciate this work, support our journalism by becoming a Maverick Insider. You'll find the details in the caption below.
So the context here, for those who haven't seen the video, is that a lunchtime meeting is arranged between Pieter-Louis Myburgh and the IDT spokesperson, Pasha Magolane. Pieter-Louis, just explain, what kind of communications were you having with these two in the lead up to that meeting? Did they explain the purpose of the face-to-face meeting?
Look, so yeah, there's a little bit of a run-up to all of this. Definitely a run-up in some context. And in as short as time as possible, in early June this year, while I was making good headway with this investigation I mentioned into a property and the other IDT contract, I was contacted by Papa Magolane, the spokesperson for the IDT. And that approach came very much out of the blue. At that point, I had no queries with him. There were no sort of outstanding media queries that I had lodged with him for an upcoming investigation. He just contacted me and asked me how it was going on WhatsApp. And then very quickly, the tone and language kind of roused my suspicion. It was not by any stretch of the imagination that it took like a normal interaction between a spokesperson and a journalist pursuing issues around the relevant government body. He was saying things like, we have things like mutual issues to discuss. He was saying these would be very private issues, very sensitive issues. And then also crucially, he made it quite clear very early on that he wanted to have a meeting with me first, person to person, face to face. And that meeting would only be in preparation for another meeting where his boss, Tebogo Malaka, would then also be present. And just the kind of the language and the context of all of this, I kind of instantly knew, or very early on, I knew that they were trying to, quite possibly, there was a very real chance that they were going to do something funny.
I mean, just a spokesperson being sort of friendly to a journalist in any context is highly suspicious. I think we can agree. They're very often quite antagonistic and hostile. Right. So he wanted two meetings initially. And did you have the first meeting, or was it eventually just condensed to that second meeting?
No, so the very next day after he contacted me on WhatsApp, he bought a flight from Joburg to Cape Town. And then on the Friday, so he contacted me on the Wednesday. By the Friday morning, he was on a flight from Joburg to Cape Town. He landed in Cape Town and he came to see me at that restaurant where I also met the CEO on Sunday. And it was during this meeting, really, that all my suspicions were almost completely confirmed. Because Magolane then went into some detail in terms of what they could offer me to more favorably report on the IDT and also to abandon my negative reporting on Ms. Malaka.
So what they were offering, Pieter-Louis, was not just cash, correct? It was more of a sort of ongoing business proposition.
Absolutely. And I think this is such a crucial point because I see just following some of the public comments and the discussions around this issue now is that They completely lowballed me, and they would have gotten away with it if they'd just been a little bit less stingy and offered more money than 60,000 Rand. But the reality is, Mr. Makhalane, during our very first meeting already, said that I could bring contractors to the IDT, my connected contractors, and then they would get tenders from the IDT from which I could then take a cut. And that was really the real sweet. It seems that the cash is more of just a bit of a bonus, a further inducement on top of the contracts that in the longer run would have benefited me to a much greater degree. Keep in mind, so at that juncture, Malaka is still the CEO of the IDT. She's not suspended yet. Presumably, she still has the power to allegedly corruptly influence tenders at the IDT to ensure that a journalist would be able to bring his contractors and score some of those IDT tenders.
It was fascinating to see in the video that Malaka initially sends away Makhalane, sort of on the grounds that she is now about to discuss things with you that Makhalane should not hear, yet he returns with the bribe. What do you make of that?
I am somewhat baffled by that still, and I have a couple of theories. I suspect that even as close as the spokesperson is or was to the CEO, it does seem that there are certain things that we are now pursuing in preparation for next week's investigation that we'll publish that maybe Annie was not privy to. I suspect, or just judging by what occurred on Sunday during the meeting, that he is fully briefed or fully understands all the dynamics that we've now uncovered around that property. And I think that maybe is why he asked him to leave at that moment when we did go into some detail around the house.
Now, you obviously were going into this meeting with absolutely no intention of accepting a bribe, needless to say. You had arranged in advance for surveillance and security. Just sketch the scene about who was keeping an eye on you there.
Yeah, so there's an incredible amount of legwork that went into this. And we had a professional firm of people who are involved in this kind of work. They assist law enforcement bodies, they do private work, they generally do security and forensic related work of this nature. And I can't divulge any more details. The agreement was that we're going to procure these services, but they will not be named because that's just the way that these kind of firms operate and prefer to operate. But it's a professional firm of forensics and investigation specialists who assisted with the surveillance, but also with the security component on the day. There were a lot of variables here. We didn't know if they were going to bring additional people, if they would be dangerous. So we also had a security element to consider in putting this together.
You obviously had to sort of string them along conversationally for long enough that you hoped they would produce something in terms of cold, hard evidence, which evidently they did. How did you sort of just keep the conversation going up until that point?
Yeah, so the viewers will notice there were some references to the weather, etc. And, a little bit of nerves talking there too. But I suppose that generally was part of the ploy conversationally to keep it going, and then to also once again to return to the important issues at hand and to ensure that we do reach that point where the bribe that was initially offered or intimated that it would actually culminate in that day's events. So it was very tricky. It's definitely very tricky. And obviously, journalistically, I think this is going to be discussed. I think possibly journalistically on ethical terms, etc. The stringing along, the public interest override, how much skullduggery, in a sense, was involved on our side to ensure that we can actually get this, what I believe definitely is an overwhelming public interest matter, documented in the way we did. Because these sting-type operations, as our lawyers also pointed out, they've become very scarce and they don't really occur that frequently, but it's not entirely unusual in journalism. Globally speaking as well, this is a form of investigative journalism where one documents alleged perpetrators in the act committing certain transgressions by not whatever means necessary, but by the means necessary to achieve those goals.
It was a hot topic in the office of the fact that when they hand you the envelope of cash, you immediately whip out your phone and take a photo of it. Tell us, first of all, why that was necessary, and second of all, how they reacted to that.
That was a completely spur of the moment decision, so we never discussed that. I sat there And I was a bit concerned about the footage around me. So just by the issues or the material that is now publicly available, everybody can see that some of it is in a tree behind me. Some of it was on a table next to us. I was a bit worried that, yes, we would have on camera a item handed to me, but it wouldn't be conclusively proven that it contains cash, South African currency. And literally at that moment, I took the chance. I knew the meeting was almost over. I knew I was at the point where I would make my exit speech, return the money to them and leave. And I thought that, what could really go wrong now? And then took my phone and documented it. It was an awkward moment. Pasha kind of asked me what I was doing, or thought that he suggested I had an app on my phone that counted the money. Because they'd given the quantum, Malaka said it's 60,000 rand. And I don't know if I mumbled. I'll have to go and check that tape again. I took the photo and said something about just being for our records. And that then obviously proves that the York packet does contain money and not some other item.
And as you say, gave a sort of exit speech where you announced you had no intention of taking the money. Did they respond to that in any way at the time as you got up?
They were in disbelief and they were shocked, definitely. If I remember correctly, Malaka turned to Pasha and said something like, no, or what's going on? And I just left. So I didn't hear what was said directly after that. But the video does show the shock. And also, judging by how quickly they then leave, they were clearly alarmed by what had happened. They left the scene very quickly. They left the restaurant via a different route from the one that they came in. Remember, so the camera ends at one point when they leave the frame. That's all we know. But we also had eyes on the ground there who described to us what they did afterwards. They walked away to a different part of the wine farm and they got an Uber from a different point to the one where they arrived.
That must have been an uncomfortable Uber ride. Have you heard from either of them since? I assume you tried to get their comment after the fact.
Yeah, so just because of this sort of totally strange, unprecedented kind of thing, we decided that I'm not going to have direct contact with them anymore. So we directed requests for comments or right of reply through Daily Maverick. And that's how we'll continue doing that for now. And they responded to acknowledge the questions at least, but they didn't respond to them on time. So that's pretty much the extent of our communication at the moment.
Pieter-Louis, something that a lot of people I think have said is that the kind of nonchalant manner in which they set up this meeting, in which they handed over a bag full of cash, even perhaps the relatively low quantum of money, suggests that there might be something quite routine about this all, that there may in fact be journalists who would accept that money. Was that your sense that this was something they had perhaps done before?
Look, I honestly think in the year 2025, 4 years post-Zondo Commission, I suppose a purging of corruption, we are still in a corruption crisis in this country. I think it's par for the course. I think it happens much more than we know about. If both parties stick to the deal, obviously we're never going to know about it. I unfortunately have a strong inkling that there are journalists on the take. And just the brazenness, as you say, with which they were willing to approach this, I think there's just kind of sense that people generally would agree to take money. That everybody's for sale, and that's the world that they operate in. You pay people to make things go your way.
Pieter-Louis, what's next? You're not done with this, obviously, this topic, this investigation?
So the actual story, so this has become like the eye-catching, more sensational element to it. And that's good. This will direct focus and attention to what the actual story is. And that is this investigation into a property and the IDT contract that we've been looking at. And that will be published very soon on Daily Maverick.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you above all, of course, for your integrity in helping bring this fairly shocking act of bribery to light. Pieter-Louis Myburgh.